USS Hornet was the third and final member of the Yorktown class to be built, and was named in honor of a Continental sloop from the Revolutionary War. Hornet helped bear the brunt of the Japanese onslaught during the early days of the Pacific War. She stung the Japanese Empire with the famous Doolittle raid and participated in two of the major carrier battles of 1942, and at one point was the only operational U.S. carrier in the Pacific. In her final action, she endured a beating and refused to go down, ultimately taking 7 Japanese torpedoes and 3 bomb hits, in addition to several U.S. torpedoes and over 400 shell hits during a failed scuttling. Initially, the U.S. had intended to only build 2 ships in this class, Yorktown and Enterprise, as by the late 1930s, work was already underway on the Essex class. But, with rising tensions in the Pacific, the Navy's General Board thought it wise to get another carrier into service as quickly as possible. As none of the Essexes would see the slipways until 1941 at the earliest, it was decided that in order to accomplish this, they needed to build another ship from the Yorktown class, since the design was already available, and overall they were rugged and fairly capable ships, as was proven during the first year of the Pacific War. Hornet's keel was laid down on September 25, 1939, at the Newport News Shipbuilding Company, and she was launched a little over a year later in mid-December of 1940. Overall, she was 824 feet long, had a beam of 83 feet at her waterline, and displaced about 20,000 tons. Her flight deck was 814 feet long, and she had 3 aircraft elevators, each with a lifting capacity of 17,000 pounds. Hornet was also equipped with 3 hydraulic catapults, 2 on the forward end of her flight deck and another one on her hangar deck. Like her sisters, Hornet was powered by 4 steam turbines that each drove a shaft using the steam generated by 9 oil-fired boilers. She was rated for 120,000 shaft horsepower and had a top speed of 32.5 knots. At 15 knots, she had a cruising range of over 12,000 nautical miles. For air defense, Hornet was equipped with 8 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in 8 single mounts and 16 1.1-inch 75 caliber guns in quad mounts located near her island. Hornet was originally equipped with 2450 caliber machine guns, but these were swapped out in January 1942 for 32 of the venerable 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. Hornet had an armor belt that varied in thickness from 2.5 to 4 inches, and her flight deck was unarmored, as was typical of all American carriers of the period. She was manned by over 2,200 men and carried over 90 aircraft. Hornet was commissioned into the fleet on October 20, 1941, with Captain Mark A. Mitcher in command. She remained in Norfolk until late November to finish fitting out, before spending most of December undergoing sea trials and conducting training. On December 27th, she got underway for the Gulf of Mexico, where she undertook her shakedown cruise. She returned to Norfolk on January 31st, and Captain Mitcher reported to the Chief of Naval Operations that his ship was, quote, ready for war at any time, at any place. Hornet and her crew would soon get their chance to prove it. On February 2, 1942, she departed Norfolk to conduct an experiment which involved 2 Army Air Force B-25s that were tied down to her deck. The B-25 Mitchell was a 2-engine medium bomber that weighed over 25,000 pounds at takeoff and needed close to 4,000 feet of runway to get into the air under normal conditions. The experiment that Hornet and her crew participated in was to see if it was possible for a B-25 to be launched from the flight deck of a carrier, and it turned out to be 100% possible. Hornet returned to Norfolk after completing this experiment to begin preparing for her deployment to the Pacific, where she was badly needed to help reinforce what was left of the Pacific Fleet. She got underway on March 4th and arrived at Naval Air Station Alameda in San Francisco Bay on the 20th. Her planes were curiously stowed on her hangar deck, and by April 1st, the reason why was evident to every crew member aboard her. She had 16 B-25s strapped to her flight deck and had welcomed aboard the officers, and enlisted men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. The next morning, Hornet slipped under the Golden Gate Bridge and out into the Pacific, and by late afternoon Captain Mitcher had revealed to his crew the nature of their endeavor, an attack on the Japanese home islands. Cheers echoed throughout the ship, and morale soared throughout her task force after the announcement. Hornet's task force was joined by Enterprise's task force north of the Hawaiian Islands on April 13th, and together they proceeded towards Japan. Foul weather harassed the ships during most of their journey, with several men being swept overboard throughout the group, but it also helped protect them from detection. Lacking radar, the Japanese had developed an early warning system by deploying guard boats to warn the home islands of any intruders. As Hornet sliced through the heavy seas during the mid-watch on April 18th, Enterprise detected several of these ships on her radar and signaled the other vessels in the group. Enterprise's radar contact was visually spotted at a distance of about 20,000 yards at 7:30 that morning. The light cruiser USS Nashville closed, and with help from some of Enterprise's aviators, dispatched the Japanese vessel to the ocean floor. The U.S. ships were still over 600 miles from Tokyo at this point, but concerned that the Japanese were now aware of them. Admiral William Halsey aboard Enterprise, who was in overall command, made the decision to launch the B-25s prematurely, as one of his orders was to protect the vital U.S. flattops at all costs. Hornet turned into a gale of more than 40 knots, which was churning the sea and causing her to pitch violently. Doolittle flew off first and shook many of the men watching when he momentarily dropped out of sight just after leaving the flight deck. He then rose, circled Hornet, and set out for Japan. By 9:20, all 16 B-25s were on their way to the heart of the Japanese Empire. They bombed military installations and factories at Kobe, Nagoya, Tokyo, Yokohama, and Yokosuka. After launching the Army bombers, the task force came about and retired towards Pearl Harbor, arriving there a week later on the 25th. On the 30th, she got underway again with Enterprise to aid in efforts to stop a Japanese invasion force heading for Port Moresby, but they arrived too late to participate in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Hornet returned to Pearl Harbor on May 26th, but the port call would be extremely brief, as she was underway again just before noon on the 28th for her next operation. Again, a part of Task Force 16, she sortied with Enterprise, 5 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers to a location northeast of Midway Island to lie in wait for the approach of the Kido Butai. On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway finally began, after what must have been several anxious days of waiting for Hornet's sailors and aviators. The battle opened with the Japanese striking the Marine garrison at Midway early on the morning of the 4th. Planes from Midway then attacked the Japanese fleet in several uncoordinated waves, but failed to do any damage. Just after 7 a.m., Hornet's first strike of the day began rolling down her flight deck, and about an hour later was on its way. 15 minutes into their flight, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Hornet's torpedo squadron VT-8, radioed the flight leader that he believed the strike was heading on the wrong course. Hornet's CAG, Commander Stanhope Ring, had a back and forth with Waldron, before the latter snapped that he was leaving the formation to attack the Japanese fleet. 3 miles below the dive bombers and fighters, he banked his plane to the southwest, and his entire squadron followed suit. Lieutenant Commander Waldron turned out to be right, and just before 9:30, he was the first of the carrier-borne planes to find the Kido Butai. His group pressed home their attack, void of any fighter cover, and were annihilated. All 15 devastators of the group were brought down, and only Ensign George H. Gay, Jr. survived. Not long after Waldron's group met their demise, torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived in succession and faced similar fates. Although they failed to inflict any damage, the courageous torpedo attacks did pull the Japanese combat air patrol down to deck level and northeast of the carrier force, which paved the way for the 47 SBDs from Enterprise and Yorktown to pounce with little resistance on the Japanese flat tops just before 10:30. The results were stunning to say the least, as within a mere 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were on fire from bow to stern. After Torpedo 8 departed, the rest of Hornet's strike planes flew on and continued to search for the Japanese carrier force. Dubbed by history as the flight to nowhere, the group eventually reached its maximum range and had to turn back. Some of them headed for Midway, while others ended up having to ditch when they ran out of fuel. Hornet's air group ended up suffering nearly a 50% loss rate for the mission, all without achieving any positive combat results. As if her air group's performance hadn't dampened the day enough, tragedy then struck when an F-4F from Yorktown, piloted by a wounded ensign Daniel Sheedy, made a rough landing, with the plane veering hard to starboard as he touched down. He had failed to turn off his gun firing switch, and as the deck crash occurred, his .50 caliber machine guns cut loose and raked the aft end of Hornet's island, killing 5 men and wounding another 20. Hornet launched another strike that afternoon, which was aimed at the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, but the strike was late and she was already on fire when they arrived. Undaunted, Hornet's aviators attacked Hiryu's escorts, but only managed several near misses. Enterprise and Hornet searched out the remaining elements of the Japanese fleet to no avail on the 5th. On the 6th, the Japanese heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma were sighted as they retired west. Hornet's planes attacked and struck Mogami twice. A second strike from Hornet arrived that afternoon and scored hits on both cruisers and the destroyer Arashio, while also damaging the destroyer Asashio with a near miss. This marked the end of offensive action by the U.S. Navy, which had won a major victory in the battle. For their part, VT-8 was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, and Lieutenant Commander Waldron posthumously received the Navy Cross. Hornet returned to Pearl Harbor on June 11th, and Captain Charles P. Mason relieved Mitcher on the 15th. Mitcher, who was promoted to Rear Admiral, assumed command of Task Force 17 and broke his flag in Hornet. For the next 4 weeks, Hornet underwent an overhaul at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. She received a new CXAM radar and had her hangar deck catapult removed. She had a 5th 1.1-inch quad mount installed on her bow and had normal maintenance and upkeep performed as well. On August 17th, Hornet got underway for the South Pacific. Hornet spent the end of August and September patrolling the waters around Guadalcanal in support of the ongoing campaign for the island. Wasp's sinking in mid-September left her as the only operational U.S. carrier in the South Pacific until mid-October. On October 5th, Hornet attacked Japanese shipping in the vicinity of the Shortland Islands, damaging 2 Japanese destroyers, which forced the temporary postponement of a planned resupply run to Guadalcanal. On the 16th, she attacked Japanese troop concentrations on Guadalcanal and the seaplane base at Rakata Bay. On the 20th, the Japanese began a major ground offensive on Guadalcanal, which was aimed at capturing Henderson Field. The IJN hoped that this would draw major elements of the U.S. Navy into a decisive battle. U.S. forces held firm and defeated the Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Despite this failure, the combined fleet continued to maneuver near the southern Solomon Islands on October 25th in the hopes of engaging Allied naval forces. Meanwhile, Task Force 61, which was composed of Task Force 16, with the hurriedly repaired Enterprise, and Task Force 17 with Hornet, was looking for a fight and searching for the Japanese. Just after 11 a.m. on October 25th, U.S. reconnaissance planes found the Japanese carrier force, but they were just out of strike range. Task Force 61 began steaming towards them at full speed, and in the afternoon launched a strike. But the Japanese, knowing that they had been spotted, changed their course, and the U.S. strike failed to make contact. The Japanese reversed course after midnight, and the two sides closed on one another until they were about 200 nautical miles apart at daybreak. Both sides launched searches at that point and prepared to attack as soon as the other ships were located. At 6:45, a U.S. plane sighted the Japanese carriers, and at 6:58, a Japanese scout reported the location of Hornet's task force. Both sides raced to get their strikes launched, and the fourth carrier battle of 1942 was underway. Hornet's first strike was in the air by 8 a.m., and a second strike followed at 8:30, 55 planes in all. At 8:40, the Japanese and American strikes actually passed each other, and a brief fight broke out, resulting in the loss of several aircraft. Just before 9 o'clock, Hornet detected the approaching Japanese aircraft on her radar and began to vector all available fighter aircraft to engage the incoming Japanese strike. However, the same problems that had plagued and handicapped U.S. fighter cover throughout all of the carrier battles of 1942 popped up again and prevented all but a few of the Wildcats from engaging the Japanese aircraft before they began their attacks on Hornet. At 9:09, the anti-aircraft guns of the task force opened up as Japanese torpedo planes and dive bombers commenced their attacks on Hornet. She soon took a bomb hit to the aft end of her flight deck, as well as quite a few near misses. The bomb penetrated 3 decks before exploding and killing 60 men. Then, a dive bomber, which was set on fire by Hornet's anti-aircraft guns, crashed into her stack, killing 7 men and spreading burning aviation fuel all over her signal deck. At the same time as the dive bombers were attacking, the torpedo bombers also made their runs on the stricken carrier, approaching Hornet from 2 different directions in a classic anvil attack. 2 torpedoes slammed into Hornet's side between 9:13 and 9:17, knocking out her engines. A second damaged Japanese dive bomber crashed into the carrier's side soon after, starting a fire near the ship's main supply of aviation fuel. By 9:20, the attack was over, and Hornet lay dead in the water and burning. With the assistance of her escorting destroyers, the fires were soon under control. Wounded personnel were evacuated from the carrier, and an attempt was made by the heavy cruiser Northampton to tow Hornet out of the battle area. Northampton began slowly towing Hornet at 2:45. Hornet's crew was on the verge of restoring power, when at 3:20 more Japanese planes arrived and she was struck by another torpedo. This torpedo strike undid all of the progress her crew had made and caused heavy flooding, which resulted in a 14-degree list to starboard. With no power to pump out the water, her crew was ordered to abandon ship. Hornet was hit by 2 more bombs before the sun set that afternoon. With a Japanese surface force approaching and towing efforts hampered thus far, Hornet was ordered to be sunk. The destroyers Mustin and Anderson attempted to scuttle her with multiple torpedoes and over 400 shells, but she remained afloat. With a Japanese surface force closing in, the 2 destroyers abandoned Hornet just after 8:30. By 10, several Japanese warships had arrived at Hornet's location, and there was some thought of towing the American carrier away as a war prize. The Japanese decided against this, and 2 destroyers finished her off with 4 more torpedoes. Just after 1:30 a.m. on October 27, 1942, she finally capsized to starboard and sank, stern first. She had lost 140 servicemen, aboard her and in the air, over the course of the day. Hornet was the last American fleet carrier to be sunk by enemy fire. She was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on January 13, 1943. Her name was revived less than a year later and given to a newly constructed Essex-class aircraft carrier with the hull number CV-12. CV-8 is honored aboard her namesake, which is now a museum ship docked in Alameda, California. In January 2019, the research vessel Petrel located Hornet's wreck more than 17,500 feet deep off the Solomon Islands. The expedition team used information from the archives of 9 other U.S. warships that saw her shortly before she was sunk. She lies upright on the ocean floor, with her signal bridge and a section of her stern that broke away lying near. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content like this.